spacebar and so forth. And once again, we're right back where we started. Engineers in China say, what are we going to do? How are we going to reimagine this? And so the story reboots. I just want to contrast that with, this is from the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California, a place I love. The curators there are tremendous. But this particular keyboard really rubbed me the wrong way when I saw it. I'll read it to you since it's hard to read. There's a section on interfaces. It says, with so many new elements to create, the museum is just a temple to technophilia. Just look at all the amazing things that human engineers have done in the realm of computing. Then you get to the keyboard section. And it basically says, oh yeah, we've got a keyboard, and that's no big thing. With so many new elements to create, computer designers were happy not to reinvent text-based input and output. They used existing teletypes and automatic typewriters, including the established QWERTY keyboard. Basically, in the history of computing, the keyboard is a big yawn. There's nothing there to study. It's not that interesting. Now contrast that with what engineers had to think about in China, in the Chinese language. The keyboard was a big deal. Okay, how do we fit 70,000 characters onto, again, repeat it with me, onto a space that has only a few slots? And I'll close here. I'm not going to go into the whole history of computing, but I will say that the inventor, the designer who solved the problem and gave birth really to not the mechanics, let's say, of computing, but to the concept and the practice that underlies all Chinese computing from day one into the present day. This is an inventor named Lin Yutang, and it is a machine called the Mingkuai. And it is a mechanical Chinese typewriter. It is not a computer, but it invents a system of interacting with a machine that we now refer to as input. Okay, just hold that in your mind for a second while I explain how this typewriter works, and then I'm going to close for some Q&A before we move over to the exhibition. Now, you'll notice that this keyboard, this typewriter, it's a Chinese typewriter, has a keyboard. Okay, this is a Chinese typewriter with a keyboard, so it's an exception in the history that we've been talking about thus far. But this keyboard does not behave in the way that you and I expect keyboards to behave. The way that we expect keyboards to behave, you push a button, and the symbol that is on that button better appear on the piece of paper or on the screen in front of me, unless I'm pressing a spacebar or shift or something. But if I'm pressing A, B, C, D, E, F, G, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I expect something to happen right away. You sit down at this typewriter, and you push one of the keys. You'll hear something happen inside the chassis of the machine, but nothing will come out on the paper. Okay? Then you press the second button on the machine. You'll hear something happen inside the machine, but you still won't see anything on the paper, but something will have changed. In this tiny little window here, which Lin Yutang referred to as his magic eye, right here and here, after depressing that second button, suddenly 8 characters will appear. And those 8 characters will be the 8 characters that match or fulfill the criteria that you just gave the machine by pushing those 2 buttons. So you basically, by pushing those 2 buttons, said, I want you to go into your database and bring back all the characters that have this piece in it and this piece in it. And then, the final stroke, you will type one of the buttons down here, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, because there are 8 options. You will choose which of those 8 you want. So, what criteria, selection. Criteria, selection. For any of you who have sat down in the Chinese computer and used it, for those of you who have a chance to play with the computer that we have on display, that's called input. That is the way that Chinese computing works. And it was invented on a mechanical Chinese typewriter. About 60 years before this concept begins to enter into the vocabulary of Western computing. So this is the gentleman and his young daughter, Lin Taiyi, who actually played a very central role in promoting the machine. The machine was never mass-produced because of the outbreak of the Chinese Civil War and then the Communist Revolution in '49, but specifically the Korean War after Mao dispatches the People's Volunteer Army. Once it's known that they're United States and are actually facing and dying at the hands of enemy combatants from China, the idea of a trade deal breaks up, but the concept lives on. And in the early advent of Chinese computing, every engineer who will build a Chinese machine will build it around this principle. Now, the symbols they will put on the keyboard will not be the same one as Lin Yutang. But that doesn't matter. You might use phonetic ways of doing input. You know, I'm telling the machine what sound of characters I want. Or you may use structural features. Doesn't matter. The phenomenon is what matters. And it's totally different than the phenomenon of typing as it exists in alphabetic world. Arguably speaking, typing in China is dead. No one types in China. They input, okay? And I'll tell you right now, and I'll close with this before Q&A, is that in Silicon Valley and places that are looking into next generation mobile technologies, next generation, it is actually input that is the future, and that they're trying to figure out how to incorporate into the realm of the alphabetic world, and it's typing that's the past. So I look forward to your questions, and I very much look forward to walking over with you to the exhibition space so you can see these things up close and personal. So let's open it up. Yes, please, gentlemen in front.
Is that machine on the screen, is that electrically driven? Or
It is not. It is mechanical. I'll show you the inside of it here. This is the inside. So this is a metal database. And what it is it's a series of octagonal 8-sided bars with about 27 characters along each of its 8 faces. Then you take one of those bars, actually you take 6 of those bars, stick them together, and you put them on a pinwheel, and they can rotate. Then you take 6 of those and stick them together, and you put them on a pinwheel, and they can rotate. So when you're pressing the button, what's happening is that you're rotating the database so that the characters that you want are in the typing position. And so, you know, eventually this will be, I don't want to say virtualized, because we often forget that computers are still material objects, right down to their core. There's no part of computers that are virtual. We just virtualize it to make it easier to think about. But this is like a super physical database. And that was the inside. So the keyboard controlled the database. Yes?
Thank you, that's fascinating. I was wondering how something like this machine copes with the incorporation of new words.
Ah, great question. How does this machine incorporate new words?
Names, like talking about Arnold Schwarzenegger or something.
Exactly. So this will be, in the history of typewriting, Chinese typewriting, that will be a constant question. We have 70,000 plus characters. How do we fit them onto the machine? The answer that most manufacturers come to is we don't. What we do is we do this rigorous statistical analysis. We figure out the 2,500 characters that we most need, and that basically account for 90% of all usage. We put those on the tray bed, but very importantly, we make sure that the tray bed is customizable. You can take characters out, you can put different characters in, and so if you work at a police station or a law office or an aeronautical firm and you need to write turbulence, turbulence, turbulence all the time, you could customize your tray bed so that's on your tray bed since you use it every day, or the surname of your boss, or political figure if you're a journalist or something like that. This is different because these metal pieces are not customizable, they're fixed to the machine. And so the answer was, I can show you, half of the characters are full body characters, like complete Chinese characters, and the other ones are partial characters. So some of them are just Chinese characters, the way you expect Chinese characters to be, and some of them are pieces of Chinese characters, so that you can shape spell them. So if you want to do a character that has these 2 pieces, you would first go through the input process of typing the left side piece, and then you would make sure not to advance the typewriter platen. You would keep it in place, and then you would type one more time, or input one more time, and then the right side piece would be stuck in. So technically speaking, you could create all of the characters of Chinese, and including ones that didn't even exist. You could just make up stuff. Yeah.
So it's not the case that you need, like these are kind of standard issue typewriters at the police station and the tax office outfit, if you're like a poet or you're writing
So poets didn't use typewriters. So this is another part of the Chinese typewriter. There is no Allen Ginsberg of China with a cigarette typing on a computer. In fact, there's a movie, we don't show it here, but if anyone's seen In the Mood for Love, okay, there's that one scene where that super hunk, what's his name, is in his newspaper office and he's using a Chinese typewriter and it's closing and his boss says, "Are you almost done?" He's like, "Oh, I'm almost done," and he's typing. That's a total myth. A journalist would never be using it for this purpose. They would have composed their manuscripts by hand. It lived a very different life than the typewriter in the Western world. But whoever made that movie, or Wong Kar-wai made that movie, and didn't realize that he was using a Western idiom, sticking a Chinese typewriter in it, and he could get away with it because no one really knew the life it actually led. I'll take two questions at once so that I can fit more in the back and in the back. So start with the lady in the blue jacket and then the blue hat.
Yeah, so
The
when
blue
you were
period.
showing the Chinese market code, there were empty blocks.
Yes.
What is that about?
Way to go. Ah, God, I love good audiences. That's so great. Okay, so while I'm scrolling back to the code, is that a good, yeah, that's a slight example. Not as good as the other one. Oh yeah, there they are. You see that there are spaces in here that are empty, and you'll see this over at the exhibit as well. Same reason. The telegraph code had 10,000 characters in it, 0001 to 9999, but that's not all Chinese characters. And so what in the code, you had built-in blank spaces so that you could fill in certain characters that you and your communicators would need on a regular basis, but that your neighbor working in a different profession might not. So every one of these systems, telegraphy, typewriting, and computing, all had certain types of customizability built in from day one. And these will become immensely important because in the 1950s, under Mao, but not directed by Mao, it was really kind of a grassroots movement, there were a group of typists who took the tray bed of their Chinese typewriters, which was, again, organized by radical stroke, the dictionary form of organizing Chinese, and they said, well, this is kind of silly, because if I'm writing Mao Zedong over and over and over again, like I would be, well, Mao is here, Zi is here, and Dong is here, so I'm going Mao Zedong, Mao Zedong, Mao. Why don't I just put them together? Like dictionary be damned, let's just put them together. And for that matter, 学生, student, 科学, science. I'm going 科学, 科学. Why don't I just go 科学, 学生? And so they started to build natural language, or really predictive text tray beds. They started to make taxonomy, a fancy word for how we organize things. They made that serve language instead of the other way around. All right? So the customizability of these systems were immensely important for their functioning. Why don't we take two questions from this side of the room before you... Oh, sorry, yes, my promised question.
Articulate my thoughts. If I'm not mistaken, the argument you're presenting is that we have language that is a code. And as a code, it's something that can be used by anybody. It has a kind of universal application, correct?
We have language that is a code that can be used... Say a bit more, I don't quite understand.
So, again, I'm not very...
No, go for it.
Could you speak just a little louder?
Okay. So Chinese in the information age. I'm
Yep.
assuming that we're talking about a Chinese language, not
Yes.
a Chinese people with inherent cultural and genetic properties.
Nothing genetic in the story, but it is related to people as well. Because if the language can't make it, if the language can't make the transition into the information age, there will be huge implications for human beings. And it's the human beings who are imagining what those implications would.
So if I understand correctly, anybody can use this. It's
Yes.
Chinese for anybody. It's not the Chinese people as
No, anyone can use them. You could, if you had reason to produce Chinese language text, you could use one of these devices if you wanted to.
So we're talking about language here, not Chinese in a broader sense.
We're talking about Chinese language in a broader sense, which is already pretty broad. Yeah.
But not a people Chinese.
No, because we're not. No, there's nothing. Because, for example, you would have. I think I follow your question, but it seems like there. 话里有话. There's a question inside the question that I'm trying to get at.
The real question is, this is for anybody.
Yes.
Just a specific cultural.
Well, what's specific about it is that the challenges that are being confronted here are not being confronted by Cyrillic Russian or German, or for that matter, Hebrew. There are different challenges being faced, but this particular collection of challenges is arguably unique to Chinese characters, and also how Chinese characters have been used in Japan, kanji, in Korea, hanja, and so forth. Let me take a few more questions before we play the table tennis game. Yes.
So I'm particularly concerned in general at this current point in time how like social media selection algorithms affect people's sort of utterances and like methods of communication.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you had anything to say about sort of how the mechanical search algorithm in the typewriter that you mentioned might have biased the patterns of language between the people that were using it to communicate, and like what, maybe some examples if you have any in mind or anything.
Absolutely. Let's see here. So now Chinese computer. There's another one. There's input. And then we've got this. Okay. I can give you two quick examples. One world or one life that the Chinese typewriter led. I'll give you a typewriter example and a computer example. One world or life the typewriter led in China that it didn't lead in this particular way in the West, although there are examples of this, a lot of examples of this, was underground printing. Okay, there are, on display is one such example, but there are many, many, many examples. I'm starting to build up another archive of these, of books that were initially typed out on a Chinese typewriter on carbon paper and then mass produced. So they were actually sort of mobile printing presses. For example, one of the most important Reform-era journals, arguably the first in post-Mao China, the production team first typed out on a mimeograph and then printed it. It's so important that, in fact, the names for these books are, well, the term is 打字有印. So 打字 to type out, 有印 to do the mimeograph. You take those words and you compress them, you get 打印, which is now the term for to print out on a printer. You can look at through these books one by one, and you know which characters they wanted to write but weren't on the machine, because those would be handwritten. So you can actually do a systematic study of thousands and thousands of these books, and you can figure out whether or not they were custom tailoring their expressive capacities to match the machine or not. Because if it was perfect, maybe they did good preparation and they outfitted their machines with all the characters they would need, or maybe every word has a synonym, so maybe we're constantly choosing the synonym that we have in front of us. That's also possible. Hard to deduce that. Now we have this new technology which is happening in China called cloud input. This is the capacity for, as you're doing Chinese input, which you'll see in the exhibition, again, just like the Min Kuai, the system is basically listening to your keystrokes and then going, okay, so she wants a character that has a pronunciation of, let me go into my database and see what I can find. Earlier in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, that entire relationship was contained inside the machine. Now, system engineers have extended that to the cloud. And so now the system is not only saying, okay, what has she said before? What is it? It is, what does she want? And what do a billion other people at this moment? What are they doing? And I gave a talk about this at the Computer History Museum, but there's actually baked into Chinese computing at this time a capacity for a form of surveillance that human society has never witnessed before, which is, right now we're used to the idea that if you send something across wire, an email or something, or a picture, that it can be intercepted. But that if I'm just sitting on my computer and I'm typing, well, that's all contained and private and closed, right? Well, not so in Chinese computing, because in essence, every keystroke is a transmission. You're sending a message to the machine is sending a message back. And once you go to the cloud, it's actually sending that transmission to the cloud in some sense. And so if you were to imagine a dissident writing a treatise of something that a government didn't like, in the quiet of their home, they're just typing. Maybe they're getting mad, and they write that mad 12 o'clock email, like and then their spouse goes, "You don't want to send that. Do not send that." And you're right. Click, drag, delete. It didn't happen, right? Well, in fact, it did happen. There would be a record of every single keystroke. And in fact, the companies have to keep these keystroke logs because it helps them improve their algorithm. So now the only safe way is pencil and paper. Yes?
Very interesting presentation. But I want to question the conclusion a little bit and see how you respond to that. You assert a continuity between the way we input the Chinese language in this typesetting, history, and the way we use and input, the word you use is input, not like Chinese nowadays. But I want to suggest that all the technology, all the way to break down the Chinese characters with the typesetting machines focus on breaking down the word itself. But nowadays, with the way we input, Chinese is actually a lot more phoneticalized. I mean, we actually romanize the character, and we try to mimic the English way of typing. So, in a way, you say input is the next big thing, but in a way, we type more Chinese nowadays than say back 50 years ago, before we know how to popularize the whole romanization method.
So I think it's an important challenge, but I hear where you're coming from, and I agree with you. Probably 8 out of the 10 steps down the road. But if we ask ourselves if we go back to 1900 and we go back to those who are saying the only way out of this is romanization. We're going to replace characters with the phonetic spelling of them, and that's the way. Because then if we do that, we don't have to make anything. We can just join the team. We can just come in, and Olivetti is ready for us, and Underwood is ready for us. So fundamental to that understanding of romanization was replacement. Now there were ideas of romanization to help standardize pronunciations. The early Republican government was really worried about the fact that a Cantonese speaker and a Beijing speaker couldn't speak to each other, so they wanted to produce a single, so they issued Zhuyin Fu Hao, which was to help little kids learn standard pronunciations. That's not romanization in the sense of this question, the idea of replacement. And what's fun, even with phonetics, what's fundamentally different is that the relationship of the human-machine interaction relationship of a Chinese inputter versus an alphabetic typist, even though there are letters on the keyboard, even though we're using phonetics, are actually fundamentally different. Because when I type the letter H, when I write the cat, or our bird bit us the other day, period. And then let's say you wanted to look at the key log of what I typed. You wanted to see what keys did he press. Well, that would be a pretty uninteresting question, because it would simply be THE space, or AUR space, bird space. If you were to look at the key log of Chinese input, first of all, you would see no relationship at all between what the person actually did at their keyboard and then the characters on the screen. There would be no Chinese there. The other thing that is important is if we could actually have done this at Stanford in the computing center. If I took the exact same Chinese text and put it in front of you, and you, and said, please input this, whatever speed you want, doesn't matter, this is not a typing test. And then I looked at your keylogs, yours, you would all be different. You would use different shortcuts, different spellings, different techniques, and so forth. So we need to not be fooled by the idea that phoneticization is a kind of movement to it. It's basically the reason that we use phonetics now, the reason that pinyin is so popular, really fundamentally speaking, because it's very recent. It's only in the Chinese computing, only in the late 80s, early 90s, is phonetic input become popular. For 30 years before that, there are practically no popular phonetic-based teaching. And the reason is basically simple, is that pinyin, the romanization system in mainland China, or Zhuyin, finally starts to get traction in the education system. So you start to have, kids coming out of school who have studied pinyin in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, so forth. And so there's a kind of pool of people who are familiar with this. And if you're a good engineer, you want to know what people are familiar with as to choose what your starting point is. So now suddenly in the 80s, and after Mao's death, after the opening of China to capitalist economies, the importation of more and more and more and more QWERTY keyboards, you're sitting there and you're an inventor in 1990 versus 1960. You're going to say to yourself, what can I do with the QWERTY keyboard and pinyin as my starting point, as my palette of colors as a painter? But what you invent will look nothing like the way that the alphabet behaves and the QWERTY keyboard behaves in the Western world. So it's really easy to get those two things mixed up because it's simulacra. They seem so much alike. They are not alike. And now more than ever, arguably. I think we have time. Let me just take the two questions here and then one here, and then we'll skedaddle. I'm so sorry. I love Q&A. It's the favorite part of the whole thing for me. Yeah.
I'm just curious, so is there also an analogous process of developing stenography?
So good, so good. Man, what's in the water down here? Absolutely, yes. Stenography.
Is there greater resemblance between stenotype machines that are developed in the West?
Oh, yes. Oh, okay, so has anyone done court stenography or studied stenotype? Okay, so if you go to a court of law, most of the time it's illegal to record the proceedings. You have to have a person that is recording. Now, they're not using a typewriter. They're using this thing called a stenotype. A typewriter has all of the letters on the keyboard in front of it. A stenotype has a bank of 8 keys on the left, a bank of 4 keys in the middle, and a bank of 8 keys on the right. And you're pressing chords. And these letter chords can be entire sentences because of a really interesting, complex way of using abbreviation and letter combinations and so forth. And as this court stenographer, you're typing at the speed of sound, at the speed of speech. So the fastest typist can type 160 words per minute. The fastest stenotype can get to like 300 words per minute because of these abbreviations. But there's an extra step in stenotype. Afterwards, you have to take the transcript that comes out, which is all garbled and doesn't make sense to the average person, and you have to translate it into natural human language. So basically, thank you for bringing this up, one way to think about Chinese computing is that China is entirely stenotype. Every Chinese computer user is in one sense form a stenotypist, but it's the computer that's doing the job of that extra level of translating. And in fact, stenotypists use computers now too. So perfect, yeah. The gentleman, yes.
Does this translate to how they build other machines? Because after you have to solve this technical problem, which is very different than the way it was solved here, and is there any trace into how they started thinking about building other?
Yeah, so does this spill out into the realm of non-language? I just finished a book that's coming out in August in MIT Press called The Chinese Typewriter, and it basically is the story from late movable type telegraphy until the Second World War, basically the end of mechanical typewriting. The second volume, which is also going to be on MIT, is about Chinese computing. And it's really been an education, because I really, as you can see, care. I don't want to just say things about things. I really want to understand how the machines work, because I think it's actually, the devil and the angels are in the details. Computing is an interesting question because I have to learn how to read circuit boards and read logic gates and so forth. And there is a question of, as I become more fluent in these languages, and as I talk to experts who know the history of designing these types of things, will there come a time when someone will say, wow, that is not how we make a logical circuit. That's so neat. Like, I've never seen that grammar of building a circuit board. But I can tell you that my instinct tells me the answer is yes, but I don't know yet. And I'll give you one example for the reason why. Most recently, the news came out that yet again, China has built the largest supercomputer on the planet. Okay, fastest on Earth, and then it's going to be an arms race with supercomputers and so forth and so on. But what's really interesting is I interviewed one of the leading experts about supercomputers to ask about its architecture, like what's special about it. And one special thing that Chinese engineers did was they actually did not use the most advanced processors in the system. They used, in essence, the next step down, or 3 steps down, and in the process, not only created the fastest supercomputer in the world at this point, but also by far the most energy efficient. And so this idea, now does that connect it to culture, does that connect it to history? Some people would want to leap in and say, well, Confucianism always liked to preserve energy and da 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 da. I think those kinds of things are nonsense, but I do think that
It's more political.
it's political, there are dimensions, they want to make their own chips, but they could have made the best chips, the fastest, and then just had the fastest all together. So there is suggestion of this, and I think the analogy that I would use is, think of the game of chess. Chess has cultural qualities to it. There are openings. When someone looks at another, two masters look at each other, like the way that someone is playing can have a flavor to it of a particular time or a place or a tradition of teaching and so forth, and where does that tradition come from? But I have to be very responsible as a writer to not jump to that conclusion and then find it everywhere, but also not to run away from that conclusion because it's subtle or because it's uncertain. And that's, again, what I was talking about at the very beginning of this talk, which is staying in that place of uncertainty and ambiguity, which is something that we all need to, I think, do. I'm so sorry that I couldn't get to all the questions, but we have an exhibition to see. I'm so excited for you to see it, and I will be answering questions there, but thank you so much.